Hello, everyone. I was asked to chime in on this really interesting conversation that some folks were having on Twitter about language, about how we speak, how we pronounce, and how we write things. But it started over a bowl of soup, bowl of stew, maybe. What do we mean? Well, it started over the question of how do we pronounce the word shorba? So, shorba, as you know, or maybe you don't know, can refer to a soup or a stew, and it's an Arabic word, a Persian word. It's also used in Assyrian, which we'll say Northeastern Neo-Aramaic in the scholarly world. So in modern Assyrian, you'll say shorba or shorva. What's the proper pronunciation? And here you see a bowl. It's not a very clean picture. That's because that's how I eat. I don't necessarily eat cleanly. Not when it's a bowl of cioppino like this. What can I say? I'm from Northern California originally, and we have good stuff like this. So, how do we pronounce it? Well, this spawned a conversation. I'm just going to read real quick, and I've highlighted or I've blocked out the names and images of the participants just because I don't want to go ahead and use those without their permission. So it begins basically about the pronunciation of shorba. Is it shorva or shorba? And it proceeds to this point where we read WB sounds are Semitic, V is not. However, there's nothing wrong with using V. The reply, V actually is Semitic, but Eastern Sureth, when the person says Sureth, he's talking about modern Assyrian or Northeastern Neo-Aramaic. V is actually Semitic, but Eastern Sureth lost the sound. Sureth Atika has the V sound. Like ktawa is actually spelled as ktava, but we say ktawa. Just be careful not to make wow as veth like Hudayi do, meaning in modern Hebrew, he's referring to how the wow letter, that is the W or the U sound, is pronounced like a V in modern Hebrew, also in Persian too, by the way. We did not have the CH and V sound prior to the Iranian influence, and we didn't have the O sound prior to the Greek influence. The F sound was also not used by the East Semitic speakers, that is to say Assyrian Babylonian, until the Roman period. CH or ch is a foreign sound in Sureth. V is not foreign. The O sound is a combination of the long A vowel plus wow. Gao, inside, written in Syriac, gao, can be pronounced as gu or go. Right. But we did not have the O sound prior to Hellenism, and we did not have the V sound in early Syriac writing. I believe the V sound in the Urmi dialect came from the influence of the Qajar dynasty. Urmi is in northwest Iran near the Turkish and Iraqi sort of area. Just kind of circle that big slice of Iran. That's where Urmi is. Arqushaya and Rukacha system was before Qajar dynasty, though. Also, why would it be added to Beth? Urmi dialect is correct using V on Beth, but incorrect using V on Wow. B and W can both be changed to the V sound, just as modern Hebrew does, to compensate the Ashkenazi Jews influenced by Indo-European or German Yiddish speech. But again, it is not our original phonology or any other original Semitic speech. But original standard Sureth wasn't that way. Beth Rukacha, the soft Beth, was V and V alone. Wow is still wow. Okay, a lot of interesting information, a lot of insider information. If you're just getting into phonology, you haven't done stuff in the Semitic languages yet, or Hebrew and Aramaic especially. So let's talk about this. I'm going to geek out a little, so forgive me in advance. Is there a V sound in Semitic languages? The V sound in not just Semitic languages, but in most languages is highly problematic. It's a very... it's an awkward sound, while it may be natural to many people today, especially in English, where we have this distinct V sound. It wasn't always the case historically. So did it exist in Semitic languages? Yes and no. And what do we mean by that? Well, there's a struggle there. And the question really is, how do we articulate it in writing? How do we know it was there if it's ambiguous? Think today just about some other languages in the meantime. If you've ever seen the movie Scarface, you know that the way that the Cubans in the movie, or at least those portraying Cubans in the movie, pronounce Cuba, right? Like it's a different B sound than you might say in English, Cuba, right? That's not how Cuba is pronounced. If you hear Spanish spoken, you might hear Valencia for Valencia, right? And so that sound is not necessarily the same as the way we would make it in English. In fact, there's a number of languages that have problems with this. And in fact, the Cyrillic alphabet tried to deal with that in two ways. Cyrillic is the alphabet used for like Russian, Serbian, Ukrainian, etc., like Bulgarian, those Slavic languages. And when you look at the first letter in blue, this is bet, or be rather, and the second one that's B, and in this kind of I'll call it lavender, but I know it's not lavender. So if you can identify that color for me, place it in the comments below. It's not lavender. It's a little different. Light rose. What do you call it? I don't know. Light purple. Anyways, so on the left we have be and then ve. So the two different letters that are both derived from B make both the B and the V sound. In ancient Greek, at least, what we know from comparative alphabets and equivalents from that, the historical B would have been ba, but in modern Greek, it's va. So you say, "Thing catalaveno," I don't understand, where there's an actual beta written in there, or vita, as it's called today. So modern Greek has a V for that letter B, or beta, vita. So you can see there's this movement between B, V, and W. It's called lenition, the process of softening something that softens over time. In German, we have something similar. We'll say that West, V. In English, West, right? The and wa. It's a problem one way or another. When we look at Latin, this V letter is originally an U sound, right? So when Caesar said, "Vini, vidi, vici," I came, I saw, I conquered. Today, we like to fancy it as "Vini, vidi, vici," with a nice Italian accent. But classical Latin and the classical pronunciation would probably lend us "Vini, vidi, vici." It's a U sound, right? And so when you have two U sounds in English, you have a double U, right? A double U. So our W, which looks like two V's put together like this, is really W, W. And that's how we get W. Two U's, or two U sounds smashed together makes W sound, right? So W. Eventually in the Latin script, the V and the U diverge. They started writing V at the beginning of words and U in the middle as as far as I understand, just a way of calligraphy, a way of writing interior words. I mean, S is like that too. S looks a little weird at the beginning and middle of words, but at the end looks like our normal S. Okay, so there's some calligraphic features that, in this case, they gave us two different letters that were distinct, one V, one U. Now, let's talk about Semitic languages a little. I do Hebrew along with Syriac or Aramaic just because, I can't expect everyone to understand or be able to read Syriac. So our B sound is clear. In later times, a small dot, a kushoyo or a kushaya, a hard sound, was placed just above the bet. Now, below the bet, is a rukocho sound, or rukacha sound. And that sound just softens the letter, right? The first word means hard, second word means soft. And that changes the B or the bet to a vet or v sound, a b sound to a v sound. In Hebrew, if you've studied the way in which the Masoretic pointing works, if there's a dagesh in a beged kepet letter, it makes a hard sound. If there's no dagesh, it makes a soft sound. And in fact, if you look at the top, where you see the Syriac and the kushoyo dot on top, you don't need that kushaya. You don't need it. It can be written without it. If it's written without it, it defaults to the hard sound. And so the dot below is really the innovation to sort of indicate where a soft sound might be. And there's many reasons for doing this. Sometimes to disambiguate words, etc. Now, what one of the people chatting was referring to earlier is how the wow, or vav in Hebrew today, is now pronounced as a V sound. Historically, is probably a W sound. And in fact, before, in the 1930s, if you were learning Hebrew, it was taught as a wow. And in fact, some, Hebrew grammars, they're going to list it as a wow consecutive or a wow as the letter. And then you pronounce wow as vav, right? Even when you're reading it in English transliteration. Well, going down, just to look at how we see the W sound, in modern dialects, we see the Beth Rukacha, as a W, and that's what was being referred to in the conversation earlier about Ktava or Ktawa. Both of those mean book, right? We're going to look at that in our next slide. We also have the classical letter Wow or Vav. I've listed the Syriac and the Hebrew there to articulate our classical W, okay? So just looking real quick, I've pointed these to show sort of how they're articulated differently today. The top is the word for book. The bottom is the word for teacher. So we have Kthava in the classical Syriac pronunciation. In the modern, you may have Kthawa, or Kthowo, Kthovo. It works across the different Western and Eastern accents, actually. So Kthava, Kthovo. Now, if you look at the bottom, we have Mallefana or Malpana, right? Why does that happen? Well, historically, each of these follows the Beged Kefeth rules. And with Mallefana, we don't really have that half vowel shva after the doubled lamed. That's a historical case. Now, basically, people say it, with a collapsed one lamed whenever they speak. So they'll say Malfana or Malpana. Malfono usually in the Western dialect and Malpana in the Eastern dialect. And if it's only one lamed, yes, it would be Malpono, but it's not. It's actually historically two lameds. And the second one has a half vowel and a shva. So it's Malefono or Malefana. Just looking here, I'm marking, in this awkward greenish yellow color, the hard sounds, and then the soft sounds I'm marking in that, pinkish, purplish, you guys tell me. I think I'm colorblind, actually. Are these even pink and blue? And well, you know better than I do. So Malefana, Malefono, Malpana, Malpono. What's the correct pronunciation? And I think the problem I have is with an idea like what's correct and what's not. We have this phenomenon of rules versus habits. Someone makes rules, right? Rules are not like, they don't come down from heaven, sorry to say. And I know that people believe that certain languages, whether it's Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopic, Arabic, that there's some kind of divine quality about them. That's really more reflected in the scriptural traditions. But when you look at language, rules are rules in the sense that someone made them. But the rules don't always work. And in fact, they give you something to learn by. Rules are for learners more than they are for speakers. You probably know that growing up, if you're from an English-speaking country, you'll probably know most of the foreigners who learned English speak better English than the native speakers. Why? Because we don't play by the rules, right? We're speakers of it. We utilize the language in all the time, right? We're using the language. Someone who has to learn it has to learn the rules in order to understand the way it's structured, the way someone has observed and articulated a grammar for the language. And that's really the case. I think we should think about these things as habits. So we have a habit of pronouncing letters in a certain way, right? And so the Beth in Syriac, the B letter in Syriac, the letter is only B, Beth, but it's articulated in at least three different ways. I would argue those three different ways go back to the Iron Age, and that's earlier than what most people think. That when the Beged Kefeth letter started, there's some evidence that it may even have happened in the Bronze Age, but that's debatable, obviously. And there's not a lot of literature published on that. We'll see. What comes out. But we do see that the B, the V, and the W are all ways of articulating what we use one letter for. And that's really the question of writing systems. How do we write things? What letters do we use to express the sounds that we're trying to make? And does everyone hear the same sound, right? So we could hear an emphatic S sound. Someone may hear a th with that sound. And so you have like these, or Arabic speakers may hear a th sound, right? And all of those things may go back to one historical sound, or they may go back to a phonological range, meaning that whatever the sound the person used when speaking, that letter would equate to all of those sounds, okay? So it's not as though that we have, the case of this is the way and whatever is not that is wrong. It's more the case of, well, when people speak, they have this set of characters that they use to reflect their speech. And so when we look at the different sounds in something like Aramaic or Hebrew, we have six. I do four and two. I don't like using my thumb when I count. Okay, 6 letters that historically are thought to have 2 sounds. In modern Hebrew, only 3 of them operate, right? In the way that classical Syriac is pronounced by Arabic speakers, we don't use the V or the P sound anymore, even though that's the history of them, right? But that's largely due to the accent that many learners of Syriac from Arabic-speaking regions grow up with. Others still pronounce the P. And in fact, if you go into, where East Syriac or Assyrian dialects are spoken, the P is everywhere. I mean, it's very productive. And it's reflected in the ancient alphabets as well. I mean, the ancient letter is P, right? And so the P softens to a P sound that becomes an F over time, like a PH, right? Philosophy instead of philosophy, right? So all of these sounds change. Look, your mouth makes sounds, your mouth moves, and nobody's sound is exactly the same. Okay, maybe, whatever. We can debate that, but if you listen to the way people speak languages, even the language I'm speaking right now, English, there's different ways of articulating the same sound or the same words. There's different ways of articulating the same words with little different sounds. So think of these all as habits more than rules. Is there a W as a B sound? Maybe, right? We don't have a lot of data because the only letter we have is Beth, B. And so with that, we can at least rely on linguistics and in phonology and how the mouth makes a B sound, right? It's labial. B. Labial means you use your lips. B. Versus V, where it's, either dentolabial. Dental means it's your teeth with your lip. V, right? B, V, W. W is also a labial sound. So when you're making these sounds, you're using similar muscles, okay? The way they're produced phonically, the way that we hear them is through the way in which our actual muscles and air work together to produce a sound like this. And so it's easy to maybe mistake or confuse one sound for another. And in fact, writing systems develop that way. I mean, comparison of German and English. The word have, I have, habe versus have, v. So English uses a V, German uses a B, right? Habe, have. Basically, it's the same word. It's the accent that's different, and that impacts the writing conventions that we use. So when it comes to the Semitic languages, was there a B as a W? There is some evidence to that. Some of it's later, some of it's after the 6th century, some of it might be earlier. That's a little bit more difficult to tell because then you're dating texts and then you're dating not just the actual text that's found in the archaeological record, but maybe a copy of it, right? And so does the copy level something the way it's pronounced? A lot of interesting questions with this. I think where I would lean on all of this is that we do have one letter, and that one letter B produces at least 3 sounds. We have several other letters, B, G, D, K, P, T, Beged, Kefat. All of those each produce at least 2 sounds. G may produce 3 sounds like B. It can produce G, R, and J. It's hard to tell when the J or the R, like where that difference happened, and if it's a regional thing, if it's a later thing, that, now it's just a convention we use to articulate sounds that do have a jim in them instead of a gomel. So, it's an interesting conversation. And I think the answer, I hope it's a satisfying yes and no, and not just an unsatisfying, yes or no, or whatever I'm trying to say. So where does that take us with regard to soup? Is it shorba or shorba? So where does soup come from? It looks like, if you look in most dictionaries, it's going to say Persian via Arabic is how we get it in modern Aramaic. Maybe that's the case, but if you look, there are some Semitic roots that could be tied to it. For example, sharbab is a root that can mean to inflame or to be hot. So you can think of like an arid desert wind as something really hot. And Akkadian gives us sharapu, and sharapu is basically to burn, or, these are similar here. The P and the B often flex with one another too. I should have added that to this conversation, a story for another time. And so what ends up happening is the sh sound, at least, by the time that Aramaic is popular and influences things like Hebrew, becomes seraph. So if you've heard seraphim, right? Who are the seraphim? They're the fiery angels, the burning angels, right? So serapa is to burn, even in the modern language too. So the words I learned for soup in classical Syriac are srafta, and mahavakta. Srafta and mahavakta. So those 2 words, that's how I understand soup. There's other words for sauces that, like, marqa is like maraq for a sauce or a soup, depending on kind of who's using the language. So shorba may in fact be related to either of these historical words that we use. If we're using a sh sound, and it is from Persian, that tells me it's probably interacting with the East Semitic world that would maintain the sh, as opposed to moving more west where the sh becomes sa. Actually, that happens in the north too. As you go more toward historical Assyria, sh becomes sa, but that's a story for another time. So all that to say, are we arguing about someone else's soup? The Persians say shorba. The folks in Central Asia will say shorva. The Persians will say shorba. I don't know. I only think if it's delicious, that's all that matters. So I hope you found the conversation interesting. It's mildly nerdy, a little complex for most folks. It's not a day one conversation. If you want to learn more about that, go look at my videos on the Beged Kefet letters and what goes into their pronunciation. And go ahead, if you have, you've learned any words or different conventions for pronouncing letters. Some of them may be native to the region, some of them may be foreign influence. Go ahead and post them in the comments below. I think the conversation for me is what was really interesting. And I read it on Twitter. I'm like, am I going to type a reply, or should I just hit record and start talking? So there you go. Thanks for watching, and enjoy a nice bowl of cioppino or some kind of a clam chowder, something delicious for me. When you think of soup, no, don't think of me when you think of soup. Think of a Seinfeld episode or something like that. Take care. See you next time.